Hey, thank you for your patience. It has taken me a little bit longer to put some of these videos together than I originally expected, but this is a follow-up to the fiction class Right Now from Pyramid Lake Writing Retreat. It was a pleasure meeting you all. I had a great time. It was great interacting and being inspired by you. And so I wanted to make this and possibly a few other very short videos to follow up on some of the specific topics that I wanted to cover but was not able to just because of time constraints. So what I wanted to talk about first that we didn't really get to touch on, I think, at all, is the idea of point of view. Which point of view do you choose? Do you choose multiple points of view and do what some people call like a braided narrative, where there might be several different stories going on, told by several different characters? I am a very big fan of that style. And I was very surprised to learn that not everybody is a very big fan of that style. In fact, people either love it or they find it really confusing. So some of that may also go with your genre and if it's sort of a typical thing in your genre. But let's go through some of the basics. So we have first person. And that's the point of view that I wrote Golden Apple. So Golden Apple I wrote in first person, but with alternating points of view. So I gave it like the beginning of the chapter will say the character's name and the date, thinking that will make it a little easier to follow, and I got some mixed feedback about that. Some people thought it made it easier, and some people were like, I got 4 chapters in before I realized that's what you were doing. So again, you take risks, and there are consequences to taking risks, but I encourage you to give it a try if that's something that appeals to you. So the benefit of first person is that the reader really gets inside the head of one. Speaking of getting inside the head, my dog is video bombing. We get inside the head of one character at a time. So your reader gets a really close-up personal perspective. The downside is the reader only gets to see what that person knows. And so we also get into, in some works we have like the there's a technical term for it, and my partner calls it the lying narrator, and now all I can think of is the lying narrator, the unreliable narrator. My partner calls it the lying narrator, and he doesn't like that. He doesn't like it when you get further into a story and you learn that the protagonist or the character whose head you were inside didn't have all the facts in the first place. I think it's, I think it's interesting. It adds another layer of surprise to the reader. But again, you might want to pick and choose what is conducive to your story. So for example, when we talk about the story where a character might transform and go from like one ideological extreme to another. Let's say your character is, alt-right and then, has this transformation and joins this like, super lefty anarchist group or whatever. Having that first-person narrator can be very interesting to your reader, because then the reader gets like right inside that character's head, and they get a really intimate look of how that transformation happens. There's, we can also look at second person. Second person is, I've been told second person is better used for short stories as opposed to full-length novels. There is one full-length work I'm familiar with, because we had to read it in high school a million years ago, called Bright Lights, Big City, and like the big deal with that book was that it was written in second person. Since then, I'm sure it's been done with other books, but it's not typical, which again gets me kind of excited, like, hey, try it out, see what you think. So second person will sound like you, like as you're reading the page, you walk into the store and the first thing you see is that there's blood on the floor, and you look up and see that somebody's running around with an axe. It's you did this and you did that and you did this. So again, it's very interesting. It literally puts the reader into the shoes of the protagonist, but it's also very limiting because the reader will only see, it's like you put a camera in front of the reader's eyes and they can only see what you force them to aim that camera at. But I think it brings in some risk and some fun, and sometimes it's fun to have a full work that is not in second person point of view, and maybe a chapter here and there that is. It builds suspense, is one of the things that you can do with that. There's also third person. Joey walked into the grocery store and the first thing he saw was, and that blah, blah, blah. So you're talking about the character, but not from the character's point of view. It's third person. There's also third close, which is, that's a very handy one. That's one that I'm also very fond of, because when you're doing third person close, your narrator is talking about the character, but occasionally dips into the character's mind. So it would sound like, Joey walked into the grocery store, and the first thing he saw was blood pooling next to the crate of bananas. He looked up just in time to see a man wielding an axe, and for a brief moment he thought of, blah, 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 whatever. So you're getting into, you can get a little more into their opinions, their reflection, but again, you want to not spend too much time in anybody's headspace because that gets into, like, Dear Diary. So we want to create a scene for the reader, and sometimes we dip into the character's mind, but we don't want to get lost in their mind. We want to go into, like, these brief flashbacks or these brief reflections or brief opinions. A character might reflect to themselves and think something snarky in their head, and you can bring that onto the page when you do third person close. So that tends to be a very flexible one because you're in the character's mind, but you're also narrating the scene. It was a humid day, 90 degrees, as Joey walked into the grocery store, and he was wiping sweat off of his neck when he looked down, and then he saw the blood. Like you can kind of get into the atmosphere a little bit more, whereas if it's first person, that character is not aware of the temperature. They're only looking at what they're looking at. They only know what they know. So you're less limited when you use that. There's also kind of like the omniscient narrator, and that's kind of like the airplane flyover view. So that is very useful because it's very flexible. But again, the more distant from the character you get with your perspective, the less intimate. That's the trade-off. So you might want to use an omniscient narrator to set the scene. You might want to use that for your opening chapter or for a chapter that gives a little more background. What I think of with that is if you've read Stephen King's Under the Dome, like the very opening scene, he does this interesting thing where he's, there's this omniscient narrator talking about a woodchuck walking down the road, and then suddenly the dome falls. And it's this flyover big picture view that sets the scene because that is a big picture moment. And then he goes in and zeroes in on how this character is affected and how that character is affected. But that is a big picture. I mean, this dome suddenly comes down over this village. That's a very, that's the kind of thing you want to have a distant narrator. It's like a plane crash. Like you can talk about the character who's on the plane as it's crashing, and there's a lot of benefit to that. But you can also talk about, this peaceful, serene morning, and, the birds are singing, and, there's hardly a cloud in the sky, and then suddenly this bright light, and it looks like a comet, but it's not. It's, and then the plane crashes. And you can do both. You can do one scene that introduces it from the long view, another scene that gets up close and personal. And if you think about, like we talked in class about how the, just the perspective of writing has changed from plot-centered to character-driven. That change, in addition to whatever role the CIA played in that, that change also followed our technology. So as consumers of visual media like movies and television shows, that's how movies are made, right? Like we have the wide-angle view, and then you have the close-up. And you don't want a movie that's all one or all the other. It alternates back and forth, and that's what keeps us hooked on the, it's almost like a part of the language of the movie we're watching. And that type of language is, you know, important in our writing as well. We get into that when we say, you know, omniscient narrator, big picture view, here's the atmosphere that you're walking into, and then close up. What is that character seeing? What do they hear? What do they feel? What are they thinking? And you can have fun going back and forth with that. So I will leave that with you to experiment with, and I think I'll do at least one more video, and if you have topics you want to hear about, let me know. But we didn't get to talk about publishing, and that's something I wanted to go over some basics on. Thanks for watching.